What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. Part 2. Let's continue with Philadelphia's greatest trainers and fighters, venues, and gymnasiums. Now, I want to talk about Lou Tendler. He was a southpaw, bantamweight, lightweight, and welterweight. He was born September 28, 1898, and he died November 7, 1970. He was 72 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Now, he had a fighting record of 171 total bouts, 145 wins, 38 knockouts, and 16 losses. One of his greatest fights was with a young man who's a Jewish fighter. Called him the Ghetto Wizard. His name was Benny Leonard. These two men would get it on twice. And that's the reason why Benny Leonard would retire, because he would break his hand against the southpaw Lou Tendler. Benny Leonard would retire in 1925, and he would make a comeback in 1932 because in 1929, the stock market would crash, and it would eat up his $500,000 savings that he had in the stock market. But Lou Tendler was a very good fighter. At one point in time, he was known as the greatest southpaw in boxing history. Now, since then, you obviously had fighters such as Michael Second to None, Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, and Earl Spence, as well as Terrence Crawford, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, many, many others. Now, the thing with Lou Tendler, he'd be in the ring with Johnny Dundee. Fought him in 1917. March 26th to be exact. And it was a very controversial decision. But Lou Tendler would give a lot of men hell because of his southpaw stance. But he would take on Benny Leonard. 1922. Oh, what a fight that was. Fight him in 1923. Great fight between the two men. So Lou Tendler fought out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Phenomenal fighter he was. Let me say one more thing about Lou Tendler before I move on. Lou Tendler would take on the first junior welterweight champion, Pinky Mitchell, and he would defeat him. And that was some task. He'd be in the ring with Mickey Walker, Jack Zivick, Joe Dundee. He was some fighter. And like I said, he was out of Philadelphia. Now, as you go back in time, you're going to find that Philadelphia would produce some great, great, great fighters. Billy Arnold was a middleweight who was in the ring with Rocky Graziano, and among others. You had Lynn Mathis. I talked about him when Lynn Mathis would be knocked out by Carlos Ortiz, but Lynn Mathis won a lot of his fights. In fact, he was undefeated before he walked into the ring with Carlos Ortiz that brutal night with 72 unanswered punches. But he was a very good fighter, lightweight contender for quite some time. You also had a fighter by the name of Gypsy Joe Harris. He was a middleweight. I remember the first time I met Gypsy Joe Harris. It was in Philadelphia in one of the gymnasiums there. And he unfortunately would lose one of his eyesights. But he came in the reign of Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Willie the Worm Monroe, Bobby Boogaloo Watts, and many, many others. But Gypsy Joe Harris was something else. He fought at the Blue Horizon. In fact, Bob Montgomery, and I'll talk about him in a moment, but he was a lightweight champion. He had the New York SAC lightweight champion when he when he took the title away from Bojack, then he would lose it to Ike Williams, and Ike Williams would eventually unify the title because he had the NBA when he took it from Juan Zarita in Mexico City in 1945. So Bob Montgomery would open up the Blue Horizon. 1971, he would be the promoter there. Well, he promoted a bout with Gypsy Joe Harris. And I remember speaking to Bob Montgomery, various conversations that we would have. And that was one of the topics that we talked about. You had Sammy Gauss and Ray Norris, George Godfrey, and Tommy Loughran. Tommy Loughran was known as the Philly Phantom. And it was Tommy Loughran who put the heavyweight division on notice. You see, when Gene Tunney would retire in 1928, his last fight was against Tom Heaney from New Zealand. And he would give up the belt. And it would Gene Tunney's decision, actually, but Tommy Loughran would take on Jack Sharkey. And they would start that tournament that would get men together for that heavyweight championship strap, and he would wind up with Max Schmeling and Jack Sharkey. I talked about that story in the previous videos. Matty Feldman and Bobby Green, Midget Wargas, and Johnny Hutchison. Now, Midget Wargas was a very good fighter. He was a champion. Tommy Spengel and Curtis the Hatchet Man Shepard. Billy Fox, we talked about him. But you had some major, major fighters. But Bernard the Executioner Hopkins comes to mind. He was a junior. His nickname was the Executioner, the Alien, and B-Hop. He was a middleweight and light heavyweight champion. He stood 6'1" and had a 75-inch reach. He was born January 15, 1965. He's 57 years of age as we speak. He was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He had a record of 67 total bouts, 55 wins, 32 knockouts, 8 losses, 2 draws, and 2 no contests. He'd be in the ring with fighters such as Oscar De La Hoya for the WBO Middleweight Championship strap 2004. He would face Felix Tito Trinidad, and he would unify the middleweight championship division in the tournament. That would begin with Bernard Hopkins would take on various opponents. He would take on Roy Jones twice, once at middleweight, once at light heavyweight. He was a very, very good fighter with Bernard Hopkins, having the greatest middleweights, top 3 at best. Bernard Hopkins was the lineal light heavyweight champion, 2011 and 2012. You can't ask for better than that from a fighter who actually came out of prison, did some time, about 6 years worth, and he was the prison state champion. He would go to different prisons and he would always come out on top. So you got to give him a lot of credit. I remember when he took on Segundo Mercado, fought him twice. Segundo Mercado was from Ecuador, and he was beating everybody. But when it was time to take on Bernard Hopkins, that's where that reign stopped. Bernard Hopkins took on David Jackson, took on Glenn Johnson, Simon Brown, Antoine Eccles several times, William Joppy, and many others. So Bernard the Executioner Hopkins was from Philadelphia, and gotta give him a lot of credit. I think his first loss was with Clinton Mitchell in Atlantic City. I was at that fight. I didn't know who Bernard Hopkins was at that time. I just saw him on the undercard, and he had lost that fight. And I think it might have been his first fight, to be honest with you. But Bernard Hopkins was a very good fighter. Saw a lot of his fights. I was at the fight at Madison Square Garden when he took on Tito Trinidad. And that was a ring classic. So shout out to Bernard the Executioner Hopkins. He was a Philadelphia fighter. And he makes Philly proud, as most of them do. Now, other fighters that you would have in Philadelphia be Matthew Saad Muhammad. Oh, what a fighter he was. Light heavyweight champion. The story behind him, at the age of 5, his aunt, who was taking care of him and his brother, couldn't take care of both of them. Told his older brother to take him in the park. One of y'all come back, because y'all both can. Took him in the park, and they would play tag. And every time his brother tried to run back towards the home, Matthew Saad Muhammad would spot him because he was that fast. So they wound up playing red light, green light, 1, 2, 3, and that didn't work. So finally, they would play hide and go seek. And Matthew Saad Muhammad would run far in the park, so his brother couldn't spot him, and his brother would run home to his aunt. And Matthew Saad Muhammad didn't know where he lived, so he was spotted in Philadelphia. And he was brought over to a Catholic nun. And before you know it, he would become one of the greatest fighters of all times. His name was Matthew Franklin. And he was given that name because of the Ben Franklin Parkway, where he was spotted. Matthew was a scripture that the nun wanted Matthew Saad Muhammad to read and to understand. But Assad Muhammad came up at a time when you had some of the greatest light heavyweights of all times, Michael Spinks and Dwight Cowie, who was Dwight Braxton at the time. You had the Davison brothers. Oh, you had so many. So Assad Muhammad was from Philadelphia, and he was a great, great fighter. And I just wanted to discuss him for one moment. Now, some fights that took place in Philadelphia, some of the greatest fights, in fact. You had Ike Williams and Bojack, their first meeting. Ike Williams weighed 134 pounds and Bojack weighed 134 pounds. And it was 33 seconds in the sixth round when Ike Williams would pour on the heat of Bojack. Let's talk about why that happened. First of all, they fought at Shrine Park in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The referee was Charlie Dowgett. And Ike Williams was not appreciated in 1947 when he would take Bob Montgomery's New York SAC lightweight championship belt. And he would unify the division because he already had the NBA. But the governor and the mayor didn't appreciate Ike Williams. They didn't consider him a champion because Bob Montgomery had lived in Philadelphia. And although Ike Williams took the title away from Bob Montgomery, but the reason why they didn't like Ike Williams was because he was tied to Frankie Palermo, Mr. Gray, who was part of the Philadelphia crime family. And that's the reason why they was giving Ike Williams a hard time. But eventually they would accept the fact that he was the world lightweight champion because no one can defeat Ike Williams. You would eventually have Jimmy Carter, who would take him out in 1951, 14 rounds. But Ike Williams would have wars with so many good fighters. And this fight took place, like I said, at the Shrine Park in Philadelphia. And Bojack would eventually throw a bolo punch, his famous bolo punch, and he would uproot the top side tooth of Ike Williams. Out came the tooth, and 47 punches would be rained on our Bojack because Ike Williams didn't appreciate it, and he would knock Bojack out in that sixth round. It was a great, great fight, an outstanding competition between these two men. They would fight twice. The second time would be in 1955, where both these men would retire after that fight. Amazing, amazing story between these two men. So Ike Williams and Bojack would take place July 12, 1948, in Shrine Park, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Another phenomenal fight that would take place at the Municipal Stadium in Philadelphia. July 11th, 1949. Ray Robinson versus Kid Gavilan. Kid Gavilan weighed 144 pounds and Ray Robinson weighed 147. The bout went 15 rounds. It was a unanimous decision in behalf of Ray Robinson, although he was cut over his eye, and many in Philadelphia thought that Ray might have lost his fight with Kid Gavilan. Kid Gavilan became a fan favorite. Now, an interesting fight with Kid Gavilan was in 1952 when he would take on Gale Turner. It was one of the greatest welterweight fights, in my opinion, of all times. Two men with two fast hands and threw punches nonstop for 11 rounds. But this fight with Ray Robinson and Kid Gavilan was absolutely, absolutely amazing. These two men put on a performance among performances. You see, Ray Robinson was a 2-1 favorite. He had 27,805 members in the crowd. They produced 175,754 in the gross gate. Ray Robinson had 40% of the gate. Kid Gavilan would earn 18.5%. But these two men would get it on. It would be one of the greatest fights during that time. And like I said, Philadelphia produced so many great fights. You had so many great fighters. Referees were outstanding as well. They were top-notch. Now, during an interview after this bout, Ray Robinson was asked a question: where do you go next? And he said he'd gladly give up his welterweight championship strap to move up to the middleweight class to take on Jake Lamotta. And Jake Lamotta would oblige. You see, these two men would face each other several times. They would finally get that rematch in 1951 because they fought each other twice in 45, twice in 43, and once in 42. And their last fight would be in 1951. Jake LaMotta and Ray Robinson. So after this fight with Gavilan, Ray Robinson seriously considered to move up to the middleweight division and try for that title. But that was a hell of a match between Ray Robinson and Kid Gavilan. They would eventually fight again. They fought again in Yankee Stadium, and Kid Gavilan always thought he won those fights between those two men. Now you had another very good fight between California Jackie Wilson and Tommy Bell. They fought January 29th, 1949. And what was interesting about these two men in connection to Ray Robinson, California Jackie Wilson at that time was in the military, and he would be a fighter who would face Ray Robinson in between the loss of Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta in 1943 and the victory of Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta in 53. Ray Robinson would face Jake LaMotta within 3 weeks' time, twice, and in between that time, he would take on California Jackie Wilson, where Tommy Bell comes into play. 1946, Ray Robinson would become the third black welterweight champion in boxing history. And that would happen when he took on Tommy Bell. No, let me correct that. The fifth black welterweight champion in boxing history. The fifth one. The first one was Joe Walcott. Second one was Dixie Kid. Third one was Young Jack Thompson. The fourth one was Henry Armstrong. And Ray Robinson became the fifth one. So this happened in December 20th, 1946. So Tommy Bell was something else. He was also in the ring with Jake LaMotta, among others. But he would take on California Jackie Wilson, January 29th, 1949. At the arena in Philadelphia. And that was a hell of a fight. I don't know why July 29th, 1946 sounds familiar. Well, Jersey Joe Walcott and Joey Maxim would have their second meeting at the Convention Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Jersey Joe Walcott weighed 191 pounds. And Joey Maxim weighed 181 pounds. The fight would go 10 rounds. And it was a very, very interesting match that was as well. Jersey Joe Walcott wasn't quite at his peak at that moment. He would eventually become the heavyweight champion in 1951 when he would knock out Azar Charles. He himself would be knocked out by Rocky Marciano in 1952 in 13 rounds. So these two men would really get it on. Joey Maxim and Jersey Joe Walcott. Joe Walcott would have his wars with Joe Louis twice in 47 and 48. They would meet up in New York's Madison Square Garden. So Joe Walcott was something else. But he took on Joey Maxim January 6, 1947 at the Convention Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. What a great fight that was between those two men. All right, so for a few more names, you have battling Levinsky. He was a light heavyweight champion. And a matter of fact, when he retired, well, he took on Gene Tunney for the America's Light Heavyweight Championship. Gene Tunney would win that title, and he would move on to do bigger and better things. You had Harry Hairpin Lewis, Gary Hinton, Jeff Chandler, Bob Montgomery, Percy Bassett, Meldrick TNT Taylor. Taylor would have his war in 1990 with Julio Cesar Chavez. I remember I was at Atlantic City when Meldrick Taylor took on a fighter by the name of Courtney Hooper. He just came back from a knee surgery. And he walked into the ring doing the Ollie Shuffle. He wanted the reporters to know that his knee was fine, and that was some fight. He kept getting hit with low blows. But Meldrick Taylor had won the fight, and he would eventually fight Rocky Balboa, and then he would get the fight with Buddy McGirt and Julio Cesar Chavez, on and on. So, what was interesting about that time, it was just so many men coming out of Philadelphia. So many men. I mean, like I said, you had Sonny Liston and Buster Drayton and Joey Giardello, Matthew Saad Muhammad. Oh, you had so many. Eventually, you have Danny Garcia and Kevin Howard, Robert Bam Bam Hines. I'm trying to think of these guys, but Philadelphia had always produced some great fighters. The arenas, like I said, you had Shrine Park, the Convention Hall, the Blue Horizon. And you would find so many local fighters that would come into those arenas. You also had, the, where the 76ers played in Philadelphia. Philadelphia Spectrum. I saw Marvelous Marvin Hagler take on Bad Benny Briscoe there, 1978. I also saw Matthew Saad Muhammad take on Yaki Lopez there, 78. So the Philadelphia Spectrum would show some great fights. Ray Robinson, I think he fought 6 times in Philadelphia. Kid Gavilan fought many times there. Bob Montgomery, well, he lived in Philadelphia, but he fought many times there. Georgie Benton, many times there. Dave Holly, many times. Jack Blackburn, many times. So Philadelphia has a history of producing great fighters. Smoking Joe Frazier. I remember walking into his gym one day, and his gym was a block away from this Gulf gas station. And in that gas station, a lot of guys hung out there. And you would find Joe Frazier there from time to time. But you'll find him in the gym. He had an office in the back. And he lived in like a basement apartment or something. But Joe Frazier was a hell of a fighter. A heavyweight. He was in there with Muhammad Ali 3 separate times, 71. I remember the 75 fight in Manila. Oh, what a great fighter was Joe Frazier. One of the greatest knockouts. I saw him when he knocked out Jimmy Ellis, New York's Madison Square Garden. Oh my God, what a knockout that was. Beautiful left hook. And he became WBAC version of the heavyweights when he took on Buster Mathis Sr. It was out of the tournament. It was just between those two men. It was the New York State Heavyweight Championship, and then they would Ring Magazine and WBC. But Joe Frazier was something else, very underrated. So he was a hell of a Philadelphia fighter. So I just wanted to name some fighters, some arenas. You had Bowie Fischer and you had Slim Jim Robinson. Oh, you had so many Brother Nassim. You had so many good trainers there. Oh man, can't think of these guys at the top of my head right now. It's unfortunate, but Willie Reddish, a lot of these guys used to be there training fighters. Bobby Green. And I just wanted to shout out Philadelphia. This is a part 2 version. I did another video, part 1, a cut off on me. So this is part 2. So thanks for hanging in there with me. Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. All great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. Charles Brewer, a lot of fighters who fought out of Philadelphia. I'm trying to think of a lot of these guys who were there. Ivan Robinson. You had the Drunken Master. Oh man, so many guys. So thanks for hanging in there with me. Peace. Shout out to Rockin' Rodney Moore. Oh, shout out to my sister, Lala D, Queen Lala D. Shout out to her. Peace.